everyone, my name is Vess and you're watching the East Auckland Property Show. This is the name of the show. And today I have as a guest the candidate for Botany Member of Parliament, Christopher Luxon.
Hey Vess, good to be with you. Really looking forward to it.
Thanks for coming. Really excited to have that quick conversation with you. And you really got my attention back, I think it was first week of lockdown, when you did the book review on Facebook.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was really interesting, someone talking about books. People are not reading books anymore. So I think it was interesting and helpful probably for a lot of people getting them through the lockdown.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big reader of books, and I sort of believe in books there's quite a lot of education and a lot of things that you can learn.
Yeah.
And so since I was a very little guy, I've always read books, and I tend to read, probably get through a good book every week, every 2 weeks. So and I always read it with a highlighter as well, and I always highlight bits that were interesting to me, and always have done it that way. So I just think there's a lot you can educate yourself around and do some self-education when you read a lot. It's important.
So let's start from the beginning.
Really? We can go there,
yeah. So you were born in Christchurch, you moved to Howick when you were 7, then you moved back to Christchurch. What was behind that moving back and forth between Christchurch and Howick?
I was born in Christchurch. What happened was my father was a sales rep for a company called Johnson & Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
And Johnson & Johnson, they sort of make things like baby powder and all that sort of thing. So I'm the oldest of 3 boys. We just smelled really good while we were growing up. And so Dad became the national sales manager out at Wiri, which is where the head office was for New Zealand.
Yeah.
And so he came up from Christchurch to do that job, and so the whole family came. And it was a great place, and as a result we came to Howick, and we rented a house first and foremost in Liston Crescent, and then we bought a house in Bert Wilson Place just off the top of Lytton Road. And then ultimately we bought a spec house in Golders Place, which is just off Culver Terrace at the top of Union Road roundabout there. So I went to Star of the Sea Convent School because it was closest to Liston Crescent at the time, and then I went to Cockle Bay Primary, and then to Howick Intermediate, St Kitts, and then Howick College. And so it was a wonderful place to grow up, and at that point all the area that you know so well and have done so many property sales and was all farmland. And so obviously that's been a huge amount of development since the 1990s onwards. So, and then what happened was Dad had left Johnson & Johnson, became general manager of a company called Sally's Chemicals, which is a home handyman company. No more gaps, no more nails, those kinds of products. And we had a lot of DIY projects around home always. And then we moved back to Christchurch, finished off high school, last part of high school, and then went on to university there before I joined Unilever, and then was away overseas for a long time. So. But growing up in Botany was a pretty special place, and I actually think growing up here just as a regular kid with a really good set of parents and great family actually served me incredibly well for what I went on to do down the road. I think it gave me a really good grounding in values and just a perspective of life when you grow up here, of what you appreciate, and you have everything you need and nothing you don't. It wasn't that complicated growing up at that time.
So back then and during your teenage years and then in uni, were more the academic type or more into sports?
No, pretty good all-rounder really. I went to a very famous cricket and rugby school called Christchurch Boys High School, so that's why sadly I am a Crusaders fan, and I apologise to all of you watching, but it is the case. But of course that school was very famous for producing outstanding cricketers and outstanding All Blacks and rugby players as well. So I played first 11 hockey, played rugby, played cricket, loved sport a lot. Squash was on the first 11, was the first squash team, and then academics was an important part, but I was pretty good all rounder really. I had a lot of big social group of friends and school prefect and all that sort of stuff, and I was very, very fortunate really. I belonged when I was in Howick here to something called Boys Brigade, and we were always taught to be sort of have physical goals, to have mental goals, to have social goals, and to be a good all-rounder was a good thing. And I've tried to do that with my own kids.
Cool. And what was your first job out of uni? What was the first thing?
So I had lots of jobs through high school and when I was here as well, part-time jobs in Howick. But my first job was, I went to university and did a 3-year Bachelor's of Commerce and Business Administration. And then I was asked on by grades to go off and do a 1-year Master's of Commerce and Business Administration. And halfway through that last year, I got recruited onto the Unilever Management Trainee Program. And Unilever was one of the big companies of the world. It was sort of one of the top 50 companies at the time. And it sells everything from sort of Streets ice cream through to, at the time, Calvin Klein cosmetics and Dove soap and Lipton tea and all those sorts of products. And so it was a very, very large company. And so I then came back to Howick, actually boarded in Lytton Road, worked in Papatoe, and did my first sales and marketing jobs really up here in Auckland at that time. And so I then became a brand manager and ran something called the home care business, which was things like, you know, Jif and, you know, and Sunlight dishwash liquid and Handy Andy floor cleaner and all that stuff. And did a good job there, and then they asked me to essentially go off to Australia and do the same job in Australia, and that was, then I spent 16 of the 18 years that I was at Unilever overseas, 6 years in Australia, where I ended up running bits of Australia and New Zealand and Asia, and spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia at that time from Sydney, and then I went to London as a global director at 28, and then at 28, 30, in that period, and then I ended up going over to Chicago as vice president. And I was there, London for 3 years, Chicago for 5 years, Toronto for 2 years, where I was president and CEO, and then I was just in the process of coming back into the US when the Air New Zealand opportunity came up. But a big company like Unilever, you know, when you're a boy from Botany, is a really great place to go to and get a business education. It is. Because you work in developed markets, you work in developing markets, you're thinking globally, you're thinking regionally in terms of pan-regional in the world, and then you think about local countries a lot. You work in different functions, you know, sales, marketing, operations, general management. You worked in different content, so you Ben and Jerry's ice cream to Impulse deodorant, you know, and then you worked in different business situations as well. You were given businesses that needed sorting out and turning around. Or you needed businesses that were very successful, you needed to keep making successful. So some of those things have different leadership implications as you think about how to lead in those times. And then the most important thing was you worked with a lot of different people from all around the world, and you worked in physical and virtual ways, and how you built culture in an organisation became very important as well. So it was a really good grounding for what I went on to do at Air New Zealand, and I also think actually for what I'll do in politics as well.
It's really interesting. I was just going to say, you know, impressive CV. Tourism New Zealand.
Tourism Industry Association, which is basically the body that organises tourism. I was on the board of Vess. We tried to get our tourism strategy right for the country. When I came back home to New Zealand, I got involved. When you run Air New Zealand, you know, you do get involved in a lot of New Zealand Inc. activity.
I was going to ask, what were the main challenges with Air New Zealand?
Oh, well, the main challenges with Air New Zealand is it's just a really difficult business to run because when you live in New Zealand and you're the national carrier, and there's 200 other commercial airlines in the world, and you're not the largest by any stretch of the imagination. And we don't have a high mix of what we call business travellers. Whereas other airlines can fill up a whole plane with just business travellers or business or first class travellers, and we didn't have that. We had tourists typically, which are much lower margin than wealthier corporate travellers. And then you don't go through New Zealand to go anywhere else. So we're not a hub that you have to go through New Zealand like Singapore or Amsterdam or places like that where you go through a place to get somewhere else. And we're just a long way away from the world, and as a consequence it's very, very expensive when you set those planes off from New Zealand to fly anywhere in the world because you're burning a lot more fuel and you're incurring a lot more costs than everyone else. So the challenge really was to say, well, that's the reality of our business. It's difficult, I get it, but actually we are going to happen to our future and not have it happen to us. We are going to be determined to be a world-class company, not a world-famous in New Zealand one. And as a result, we want to have ambition and aspiration, and we better get really good at learning to deal with the cards we're dealt with and find sources of competitive advantage that we could do very well. And so that's what we proceeded to do. And, you know, really it was a great story, and it was an outstanding team that we built there that worked together and could all play, you know, and do what they did so well. You know, as CEO, we had outstanding engineers, you know, just amazing people, and I just, you know, I could never do what they do. And likewise, we had outstanding pilots and really good cabin crew, but we also had really good salespeople and really good supply chain people. And so really your job as the CEO is, yes, you're sort of first five in the team and sort of captaining the team, but you do need to pass the ball. It's a team sport, and you need to, you know, pass it to your colleagues and let them run with it for a bit, and keep a sense of where we're going and what the game plan is, obviously, but you learn a lot about that. So a really great team sport, and as a result became a great place people wanted to work. in my time there, we would have 50,000 people apply for 1,000 jobs every year. 60% of the country wanted to work there at the company, and it was the number one place, voted, people wanted to work and was the best place to work. So, on a cultural sense, in leadership sense, we built good leaders, and we tried to get people to be, develop themselves personally as well as their professional skills.
I was going to ask, were you more hands-on leader or more delegating?
No, pretty hands-on. It depends on a little bit on the situation.
Yeah.
So I've been a big believer, if you've got a turnaround job. So when I first went there, our international division, which was half the company, was losing $2 million a week. I talked about that publicly.
A week?
A week, yeah. And so you need to get very focused very quickly. Either you're fixing that problem or you're sort of not. But you can't have that just dribble on and not face up to that reality. So in those sort of circumstances, you get very clear, and often a decision, whether it's right or wrong, is a hard yes or a hard no, and a turnaround job is so much more important than let me go away and think about it, and let's get a team to look into that problem, and no, you just need to go yes, no, and get about 70% of those decisions right. Because if you're serious about turning around a business, and I've done a lot of them, you really only have 12 to 15 months before you've actually burnt through your people's energy, and you really need to be in a very different place. So a turnaround job's very different from a sustaining success. At the end of my time at New Zealand, it was a very successful business, and we had to play good defence and do the things that we did well, and make sure we understood them from our past, and we kept preserving and enhancing them. But on the other side, we also had to plant new strategic seeds around sustainability, around customer experience, around digital, that we were making big investments in order to pay off for us in 5, 10 or 15 years now from the future. Big investments in aircraft. We spent billions of dollars on upgrading that fleet, because when I first started, we had aircraft that were 20, 25 years old, and that wasn't going to be good for our customer proposition down the road. So it is a bit situational dependent. You're always the same person, the same leader, but as to what your role becomes is a little bit shaped by the business situation that you're in.
Interesting, and it's a industry that I'm really interested in. I used to work as a flight attendant back home for 2 years during my university years.
Yes, fantastic.
And it was really interesting. But after having that,
I think that was the other big takeaway, is that people got very fixated on planes, because they, and if you're an engineer or a pilot, it was all about the planes and where you could fly these things and what they could do. But, the mantra we had, and actually Ralph Norris had coined it before me, which was, we fly people, not planes. And so realising you're in a people business and a service business was so much more important than realising the actual what you did, which was defy gravity and get a plane from A to B. That was all very interesting, but the bigger issue was actually it's a service business. And when you come from New Zealand and you have all those so-called industry disadvantages that people would say that we had, you realise the one thing that cannot be copied, that is different, is your people. And that's why when I talk culture and leadership, it's not because we talked about that in the same amount of time as we did about the customer experience, as we did about the commercial results, because it was as equal to us as those other two bits.
Interesting. And after having all the extremely successful career, how one decides to jump into moving?
It's a question I get asked a lot, actually. I keep wondering whether people really why they're asking it. But no, I guess
it's interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, well, you get to a stage in life, I was 48, and you sort of think, well, do I carry on and do this job for another 7 years? There's probably only one other corporate job I could have done in New Zealand at that time. But more importantly for me, and it's something that I'd actually had from when I lived here in Howick and Botany, was, even as a little boy, was that public service is actually a very good thought. Not the politics, but the public service piece of it. And, John F. Kennedy famously sort of talked about that and inspired a whole generation around that. And I sort of come from that mode that I feel very blessed that I've been very successful and very fortunate, and I've made some good decisions, and I've worked incredibly hard for all of that to come together. But the reality is also it's a good chance for me to be able to give back. And when you sit in that role as the CEO of Air New Zealand, you are part of many forums, whether it's the New Zealand China Council, the Australia New Zealand Leadership Forum, industry bodies, and you start to get I chaired the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, and so you see the New Zealand issues pretty clearly, and And what you realise is, and having spent 16 years overseas, is and you know this from your own experience, there's good and bad bits to every country and their systems, and you realise that New Zealand is pretty special. But for New Zealand to do well, it needs to continue to punch above its weight big time.
Yeah.
And the reality is, otherwise we just become another 5 million people country on earth, of which there are many, but we do better when we really punch above our weight as a result. And we've been successful at that over the last 30 years, I think, by and large as a country. And so you want to make sure in the next 30 years that we continue to do that. And as I looked at it, I see a lot of challenges, but I also see huge amounts of opportunities for New Zealand. And I think coming from my background with the skills that I kind of have of being able to think strategically, solve problems, get things done through, with and for people, that can be transferable into the political world. And I also believe that there are three big actors in civil society. You need great community leaders and organisations because they see the needs that are happening in the communities. You need government to set the train tracks in motion and the rules and the guidelines so that people can actually operate. And businesses, there's a big responsibility there for business leaders too to do more than just make money. Yes, it drives employment, but actually they have a role to play in society and helping society be better too. And they can move with great speed, and actually execute for their employees incredibly well. So, having seen two of those bits up close, that's what I've been enjoying, is seeing the community side of it. But I also just felt, that, we also have a series of often career politicians that come into politics, and they come from a world where they've been student body politicians at university. And I don't mean to knock it, but then they come into being advisors to ministers or MPs, and they become the MPs and ministers. And as a result, you miss some real world experience and some perspective of both global and local perspective that I think those of us coming from different experiences before we come to politics is actually very helpful. So that was some of the thinking.
Yeah. And where do you see Botany in 10 years? What's the future of Botany in 10 years? I mean, what's your vision for the future of Botany?
To be honest, I think we have a mindset problem out here in Botany and in East Auckland in general. And when I mean East Auckland, I mean Pakuranga, Botany combined in the electorate sense. And the reason is that we already have 130,000 people that live here. And we'll have another 30,000 people that will be added here by 2030. So you're already today at 130,000 people. I mean, that's the size of Dunedin and Tauranga. And yet we are chronically underserved in terms of the services that we have here in Botany. And it's because of our mindset that we are still sleeper suburbs of Greater Auckland. We still act like we're Howick and Cockle Bay and Dannemora and East Tamaki Heights, and we don't realise actually there's a real power in that collectiveness of thinking about an East Auckland strategy. And the reality is South Auckland, West Auckland, North Shore have done much better in terms of capturing those services. So we're chronically underserved in my view on a number of things. So there's sort of 5 things we have to do. One is we have to make sure that small business is at the heart of this economic recovery. And for us in Botany, small businesses in our DNA, just here in East Tamaki alone, there's 2,000 businesses, there's $3.5 billion worth of GDP. Those companies employ over 30,000 people. And that's just the East Tamaki component, not the rest of East Auckland. So we've got to make sure we do that. Secondarily, we really have to get our transport in shape. The congestion, we talk about it and we can talk about it forever, but we've got to stop that stuff. I mean, since 2005, there's been this talk of this Eastern Busway. We've now just started phase 1, which is the Panmure to Pakuranga piece. We've had 1 year of construction, 3 years of conversation ever since the Panmure station was built. Before that's really just been consenting and consultation. And you do sit there and go, well, when I go to Denmark or Switzerland or Singapore
Germany.
or Ireland or Israel, other small countries, you wouldn't tolerate 25 years to get a bus lane together, from Botany to Panmure to go so you can go to the city. So we have to be quite a lot more intolerant about those sorts of things and use our power at central and local government to get those things done. John Kennedy sent men from the moon from when he talked about it to when he did it in 9.5 years in the 60s. And we seem to struggle to put a bus line between, Panmure and Botany in 25 years. And so, we have some real problems in infrastructure in this country, and that's another whole story. The third thing really is, after the transport, is really thinking about how do we get more medical services and health services into the electorate. there's a lot of residents that I've spoken to in the last 6-7 months who are leaving Botany to go out to Middlemore or to the super clinic for a really basic drip service or a quick treatment, and those things could be done inside the electorate, I think, very well. So we've got to expand our health services. I think the other thing is out the Flatbush way. There's been a lot of investment in housing, but very little supporting infrastructure. And I'd love to see a community centre there. I know Adele White from the Howick Board's very passionate about that as well, which is great. And the last thing is people have worked incredibly hard to get here. People in Botany, whether you've been here 40 years living in Howick, Cockle Bay, or whether you've been here 4 years living in Flatbush as a new migrant to this country, the common thing is that everybody has ambition and aspiration. They're all wanting to work hard for themselves, their family and their community, and so we need to protect that with really good law and order and safety for people. So the other 5 things that I think I'd be focusing on, or will be focusing on, and then of course, I think it's about having a representative that can represent you at a local level incredibly well. And I think we've got to get more done than what's being done. And I think equally someone who can think about New Zealand and where that's going a little bit as well is, I think, important.
Yeah.
That's a pleasure to be with you, and thanks for what you do as well in the community. It's really fantastic, and I think I can understand why people want to buy houses out there. It's a pretty cool place to live, and having grown up here, I know that personally. So thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Chris.
Appreciate it. All right.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next one.